So our next novel that we're going to read is Animal Farm by George Orwell. And we're going to do this presentation in 3 parts. The first one is just a general introduction to the book. The second one, we're going to look at the definitions of allegory, satire, and fable. And then the third one, we're going to look at the political connections within Soviet Russia that tie in with the book, just for background information. So let's get going with the first part of our presentation. George Orwell was a British author and journalist. He lived from 1903 to 1950. He was born in India, and he was known as a political and cultural commentator. He was a popular novelist in the 20th century, but he also wrote essays, and he was best known for his 2 novels, Animal Farm in 1984, both of which you will read here at Edison. One of the quotes from the book is, "Liberty is telling people what they do not want to hear." He was born in India. His father worked there for the government, and so he spent his early years in India as a child. And as a child, he was a fairly lonely person, and so he would create imaginary characters and then have conversations with those imaginary companions. When he grew to be an adult, he worked for the Imperial Police in British-occupied India. So this influenced how he saw the world. It influenced how he understood and experienced government, and that comes through in his writing. George Orwell believed that standing apart from the group was a good thing, to not be part of that crowd. He didn't like being part of the crowd. He opposed it. He viewed socialists, communists, and fascists as repressive and self-serving. And his belief was that if it came to a choice of a government flexing its might and showing how tough it was and doing the right thing, that it would always choose flexing its might. An interesting fact about Orwell is that his pen name was George Orwell. His real name was Eric Blair. And just a little piece of trivia, when an author doesn't use their own name to write and they publish a book but it's under a different name, do you know what that's called? It's their pen name, but it's also called a pseudonym. They use a different name to write under. Or sometimes it's called a nom de plume. Just a little trivia there. Okay, the novel 1984, which you will read in later years here at high school, was published in 1949. It took place in 1984, and it presented a totalitarian state where every aspect, including people's thoughts, were controlled by the government. The state is ruled by a group in 1984, and the group was known as the Party. And its leader and dictator is Big Brother. Big Brother's watching you. That's where this idea came from. So that's the novel 1984. But the novel that we're going to read is Animal Farm. So why animals? Well, in explaining how he came to write Animal Farm, Orwell says that once he saw a little boy whipping a horse. And he said about this experience, it struck me that if only such animals became aware of their own strength, we, as people, we should have no power over them, and that men exploit animals in much the same way as the rich exploit the worker. So it started kind of the wheels going in his head, thinking about how strong that animal was and comparing it to how the rich treated workers. And so he comes up with this story. So what is Animal Farm? Well, Animal Farm is a masterpiece of political satire. Remember, satire is when something is written so ridiculously that a point is made and people understand what's being said. Animal Farm is a tale of oppressed individuals who long for freedom but ultimately are corrupted by assuming the very power that had originally oppressed them. The story traces the deplorable conditions of mistreated animals who can speak and who exhibit many human characteristics. After extreme negligence by their owner, the animals revolt and expel Mr. Jones and his wife from the farm, and they take over the farm. And then the story is about what happens. Animal Farm is generally viewed as Orwell's critique of the communist system in the former Soviet Union. So what's the significance today? Why do we even bother to read this story? Because Soviet communism and the Cold War, they've fallen, but we still have Animal Farm. So is it worth us even reading today? Well, the answer lies in the power of allegory. Remember, we looked at allegory when we did Golden Kite, Silver Wind, when the two Chinese villages kept building walls to defeat the other one, and it was kind of likened to the arms race during the Cold War. Allegorical fable requires the reader to make comparisons and connections, and this can be meaningful to any reader at any time period. And so we continue to read these stories, and particularly in this case, Animal Farm. The story of Animal Farm will always have lessons to teach us as people about the ways that people abuse power and the ways that they manipulate others. Orwell's chilling story of betrayal, of idealism through tyranny and corruption is fresh and relevant today as it was when it was first published in 1984. So a children's book? No! Actually, when it was first published in 1945 and it went into the bookstores, booksellers were actually putting it on the shelves with children's books. And Orwell was so discombobulated and upset about that he began traveling from bookstore to bookstore to bookstore requesting that the book be shelved with adult works. And this dual identity as a children's story and adult satire has stayed with this story for more than 60 years. So this is a story that we're going to read. And this ends part 1 of the introduction to Animal Farm.